The silence of the empty quarter wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Mina Vance gripped the passenger side handle of the 4x4 as the tires churned through a sea of powdered gold. Beside her, Will Prescott was a statue of focused muscle. They were deep in the Rub al Khali, miles past the old money world of Edgar's high-tech caravan. "He's still there," Will muttered. "Edgar?" Mina glanced back. "He's not alone," Will added, his jaw tightening. "He's still got that local kid, Hassan, tucked in the back of his lead Rover. I saw the boy's face when we broke off from the main group. He looked terrified, Mina. Edgar's been filling his head with stories about ancestral duty just to keep him from running back to his village." Mina remembered the boy, 19 with eyes too large for his thin face. Edgar had introduced him as a cultural consultant, but Mina had seen the way Miller, Edgar's security chief, handled the boy like a piece of luggage. "Hassan is a scout, Will. His grandfather was one of the last to map the salt pan," Mina said softly. "Edgar didn't hire him for his company. He hired him for his bloodline. He thinks the boy is a key." "He's a kid," Will grumbled. "And Edgar is going to get him killed trying to unlock a door that doesn't want to be opened." "He needs better discernment about who to involve himself with," Mina said, reaching into her fruit basket, her fingers brushing the leather cover of her Bible. "His bloodline might have history with the Ubar, but Edgar is looking for a sacrifice, not a scout." The words had barely left her lips when the world turned upside down. A muffled thud vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of a small incendiary charge hidden near the fuel line. A tongue of orange flame licked the hood. "Bail!" Will roared. He didn't wait for the vehicle to stop. He steered into the steep face of a 100-foot dune, intentionally rolling the truck to kill the momentum. The cabin groaned as it flipped. Glass shattered. Metal screamed against sand. Mina felt the weightless, sickening spin. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering a rhythm of pure survival. When the world finally stopped rotating, she was hanging upside down in her harness. The smell of gasoline and scorched rubber was overwhelming. "Mina, talk to me!" Will's voice was frantic. He was already out, kicking the windshield in. "I'm here," she gasped, coughing against the smoke. Will reached in, his hands like iron as he sliced her seatbelt with his tactical knife. He hauled her out through the jagged frame of the window just as a second explosion sent a plume of black smoke into the pristine blue sky. They scrambled back, sliding down the face of the dune. They watched as their supplies, their food, their radio, their hope of a ride out, morphed into a blackened skeleton of steel. Will didn't waste a second on grief. He ran back toward the edge of the heat, his face soot-streaked and raw. He grabbed a tattered, heavy-duty tarp that had been thrown clear and a single dented plastic bucket. "Mina, the canteens!" he yelled. She spotted them, 2 stainless steel bottles half buried in the sand 20 feet from the wreck. She lunged for them, her fingers burning as she snatched them up. They stood at the base of the dune, gasping for air, as the fire consumed their past. Around them the desert stretched out, indifferent and vast. The brilliance of the sun was blinding, and somewhere above them, a silent drone recorded their desperation. Will looked at the 2 canteens, then at the empty bucket and the tattered tarp. He looked at Mina, his gaze lingering on the soot on her forehead and the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. "We have 2 liters of water, a bucket, and a plastic sheet," Will said, his voice tight, "and about 100 miles of nothing between us and the nearest well." Mina wiped the sweat from her brow, her hand steady. "Then we'd better start walking, Will. I think the Lord wants us to see something that doesn't belong to the world of stakeholders and patents." 4 hours in, the desert became an enemy. As Will and Mina struggled through the heat, the drone wasn't their only shadow. Far behind them, atop a distant ridge, a black SUV sat idling. Inside that vehicle, Edgar watched the monitors, but Hassan sat in the jump seat, his hands shaking as he clutched a prayer bead. "They're going to die, sir," Hassan whispered, watching Mina stumble on the screen. "We should help them." Edgar didn't look away from the thermal feed. They aren't dying, Hassan. They're being refined, and you need to watch closely. When we reach the salt, you'll need the same refinement if you're going to lead me to the gate. Miller, give the boy some water. I need his brain sharp, not sentimental. Miller handed Hassan a bottle with a look of pure indifference. To them, Hassan wasn't a person. He was a biological GPS waiting to be activated. For Mina and Will, the heat wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical weight pressing against their lungs. Every step into the shifting dunes felt like wading through deep water. Will led the way, his broad shoulders hunched, the tattered tarp draped over his head like a makeshift cowl. He was carrying the heavy bucket and the bulk of the salvaged gear, his pace steady but his movements becoming increasingly stiff. "Drink," Will rasped, stopping in the meagre shade of a sun-bleached rock rib. He handed Mina the stainless steel canteen. Mina took a small sip, the water lukewarm and tasting of metal, before holding it back out to him. "You first this time, Will. You're burning through twice the energy I am." "I'm fine," he snapped, then immediately winced at his own tone. He took the canteen, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of raw human heat that had nothing to do with the sun. He looked at her then, his eyes bloodshot and searching. "I'm sorry. I don't like being hunted when I can't hit back." "You're doing great, Will," she said softly, her voice the only cool thing in the wasteland. They moved on, but the environment began to shift. A low, rhythmic humming started to vibrate through the soles of their boots. It sounded like 1,000 bees, or a distant choir. "The singing sands," Mina whispered. "The friction of the dunes. It creates a frequency." But for Will, the frequency was changing. To his dehydrated brain, the humming began to sound like the thrum of a Black Hawk helicopter. He blinked, and the shimmering horizon didn't show sand. It showed a landing pad. He saw the green and tan camouflage of his old unit. He saw his commanding officer waving him over. Will, stop!" Mina's voice sounded miles away. "They're here, Mina," Will muttered, his voice thick with a sudden manic hope. He started to pick up his pace, shedding the heavy bucket, his eyes fixed on a jagged limestone ridge that dropped off into a sheer 500-foot canyon. "Extraction! They found us! Come on!" "Will, there's nothing there." He didn't hear her. He was running now, his boots kicking up sprays of orange dust. He reached the edge of the ridge, his toes inches from the crumbling precipice, his arms reaching out for a rescue that was nothing but a trick of the light and the heat. "Will, no!" Mina lunged, her fingers catching the back of his tactical vest. She threw her entire weight backward, her boots sliding in the loose grit. They tumbled together into the sand, rolling away from the edge. Will fought her for a second, his mind still trapped in the hallucination, until Mina grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. "Will Prescott, look at me," she commanded, her voice ringing with authority. "Look at my eyes. There is no chopper. There is only us. Stay with me." The brilliance seemed to shatter. Will's vision cleared, the green ghosts of his unit dissolving into the harsh reality of the limestone and sun. He was pinned beneath her, his chest heaving, his heart thundering against his ribs. The silence that followed was deafening. Mina didn't move. Her hands were still framing his face, her thumbs brushing the stubble on his jaw. The professional guide and the tactical specialist were gone. There were only two people, raw and exhausted, realizing how close they had just come to the end. Will's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The shyness he usually carried, the stiffness of the Prescott name, was stripped away by the sheer terror of the moment. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly, and tucked a stray, sweat-dampened lock of hair behind her ear. "Mina," he whispered, his voice cracking. I almost left you alone out here." "You're not going anywhere," she replied, her voice a breathy vow. He started to lean in, his intention written in the sudden softening of his features. The almost confession was hanging in the air, a heartbeat away from becoming real. Then a sharp, metallic click echoed from above. Will's military instincts slammed back into place. He rolled, shielding Mina with his body, and looked up. High above, catching a stray glint of the sun, was a sleek black shape. The drone had dipped low, too low. It was hovering like a vulture, its camera lens tracking their every breath. The moment was broken. The prophet was still watching. The sun didn't just set, it died, bleeding a final scorched orange across a sky of brass before plunging the empty quarter into a chilling, moonless blue. Above, the low battery whine of the surveillance drone finally cut out. It banked, a predatory shadow retreating toward the horizon, leaving them in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. They were alone. Truly alone. Will and Mina had finished the trenches an hour ago, stumbling upon a geological anomaly, a natural depression where a few stubborn grey-green shrubs clung to life. If there was moisture in this hellscape, it was here, trapped in the rock veins of the valley floor. They had lined the largest ditch with their tattered tarp, weighing the edges down with jagged stones. Now there was nothing left but the weight. Will sat on the edge of the dry pit, his body vibrating with exhaustion. His throat felt like it had been scraped with a rusted file. Every breath tasted of salt and ancient dust. "Will," Mina whispered, reaching out. Her touch was the only thing keeping him from drifting into the delirium of dehydration. "Talk to me. Keep your mind here." Will stared at his hands. The skin was raw, the blisters weeping into the sand. "I keep thinking about the logistics, Mina," he rasped, his voice a jagged shadow of its former self. "I'm a Prescott. I was raised to trust the gear, the intel, the tactical advantage. But the gear is dead and the intel brought us to a grave." He looked up at the stars, his eyes bloodshot and burning. For the first time, he stopped looking for an exit strategy and started looking for a savior. "I'm empty," he breathed, the confession tearing out of his chest. He wasn't performing. He was breaking. "If you're the God she talks to, I've done everything I can. I've dug the hole. I'm sitting in the dirt. I need you to do the rest. Give us away or let us go home." The wind died. The desert held its breath. Then a sound. Not a drip, but a low, guttural gurgle from beneath the earth. The tarp groaned as something pushed against it from below. Will frozen. A dark, shimmering pool began to swell at the center of the plastic. It wasn't a trickle. It was a steady, rhythmic welling, cold and clear, bubbling up from the ancient deeps as if the desert itself had been forced to surrender its lifeblood. The ditches were filling. Will plunged the salvaged bucket into the rising pool, his hands shaking so hard the water splashed his face. He didn't drink first. He turned to Mina, his eyes shining with a terrifying, beautiful light. "Drink," he whispered, pressing the rim to her lips. "He heard us, Mina. The morning is coming, and we're still here." "Would you like me to continue into the morning after? Or should we spend a moment in the feelings and whatnot, as the water continues to rise in the moonlight?" The miracle of the water was still wet on their skin when the dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Will heard them before he saw them, the low, rhythmic thrum of high-displacement engines. He stood up, shielding Mina with his body, his hand instinctively reaching for the tactical knife at his belt. But he was dehydrated, his muscles trembling from the adrenaline crash of the day. 3 blacked-out armoured SUVs crested the dunes like sharks breaking the surface of the sea. They circled the small oasis Mina and Will had dug with a precision that was terrifying. The doors opened in unison. 6 men in sand-coloured tactical gear stepped out, but these weren't soldiers. They were private contractors, their rifles held at low ready. Finally, the rear door of the lead vehicle opened and Edgar stepped out. He looked ridiculous. Pristine white linen, a Panama hat, and a silk scarf. but the look in his eyes was anything but funny. He stared at the shimmering pool of water in the tarp. "I expected to find bodies, Mina," Edgar said, his voice smooth and cold. "Instead, I find a fountain. You truly are a marvel." "We're leaving, Edgar." Will stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "We don't want your help. Just stay out of our way." Edgar didn't look at Will. He flicked a finger. Two of the contractors stepped forward, the muzzles of their rifles lifting just enough to be a statement. "I'm afraid that's not an option, Will," Edgar said. "You see, my sensors track the seismic event that caused this miracle. This isn't just a well, it's a pressure leak. You've tapped into the outer cooling veins of Ubar itself. You've found the door for me." "It's not a door for you, Edgar," Mina said, her voice steady despite the guns. "It's a holy place. Leave it alone." Edgar's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Miller, escort our prophet and her guardian to the second vehicle. Secure their hands. I can't have them wandering off before the opening ceremony." The interior of the SUV was a jarring contrast to the desert. Recycled air, leather seats, and the hum of monitors. Will's hands were zip-tied in front of him, his jaw set in a hard line. Mina sat beside him, her fruit basket clutched in her lap, her eyes closed in silent prayer. "He's going to use us," Will whispered, leaning close to her so the driver couldn't hear. "He knows he can't find the city without your intuition. He's not a seeker, Mina. He's a looter." "He's more than that, Will," Mina replied softly. "He's a man who thinks he can buy a miracle. But the desert has a way of correcting the ledger." In the front seat, Edgar turned around, holding a tablet showing the GPS coordinates of the salt pan ahead. "Don't be so grim, you two. You're about to be part of the greatest discovery of the century. You should be thanking me for the ride." "We've already seen the greatest discovery, Edgar," Mina said, looking him dead in the eye. "And he doesn't require a security detail." Edgar's face darkened for a split second, the false prophet hating the truth, before he turned back to his screen. "We'll see what God has to say when we're standing on a floor of solid gold." The GPS had been dead for 3 miles. Will and Mina, now prisoners in Edgar's convoy, were forced out into a blinding white salt pan that looked like the surface of a dead moon. Will's tactical sensors were flat, the screens flickering with static. "Nothing," Will grunted, his hand resting near the zip ties Miller had finally removed, though the contractors still had their rifles leveled. "The ground is solid. We're chasing a ghost, Edgar." Edgar paced the salt, his frustration boiling over. He looked at Hassan, who was trembling, then at Mina. You found the water. Find the path. The map you pulled from the wreck. It shows the coordinates right here." Mina looked at the charred vellum fragment of the map she'd salvaged from the 4x4. It wasn't just a map of geography, it was a map of sound. She remembered the late nights in the archives, translating the fragmented diaries of 9th century travellers who spoke of the pulse of the hidden. "The map doesn't show a place, Edgar. It shows a frequency," Mina said. She reached out and clicked the off switch on Will's remaining gear. "It's a secret. And secrets don't open for machines." She took Will's hand, her grip firm and grounding. "I found a reference to this in the Omani scrolls," she whispered to him, ignoring Edgar. "The travellers called it the heave of the earth. It's not about where you walk. It's about how." "What do we do?" Will asked, trusting her completely. "Match the vibration of the ground. It's a rhythmic cadence," she commanded. 3 steps slow, 1 step long. We have to become part of the salt's own breath." They began to move. At first, it felt clumsy, a strange, syncopated dance in the middle of a wasteland. Edgar and his men watched with sneering disbelief. But then, the ground began to answer. The singing sands grew from a low hum into a deep, cello-like vibration that rattled the bones in Mina's chest. The air began to ripple with heat haze, but the salt crystals under their feet didn't just shimmer. They began to liquefy, swirling like a golden whirlpool as the resonance unlocked the desert's floor. "It's working," Will breathed, feeling the ground soften. "Don't break the rhythm," Mina cried as the center of the pan began to give way. "Stay with me, Will. 3 slow, 1 long." "Don't stop," Mina cried as the ground turned into a swirling whirlpool of golden sand. They were inhaled by the desert, tumbling through ancient rotating gears, the clockwork heart of Ubar. A surge of pressurized air separated them. Mina and Will were spat out onto a high brass catwalk overlooking the giant city machine. Hassan was caught in a filtration grate 50 feet below, dangling over a churning river. Edgar and Miller were swept all the way to the bottom, into the great sump where the gold and the rising flood awaited. The story continues through the clockwork rescue, the valve of faith, and the final seal. Is this more cohesive for you, Christina? By putting Chapter 3's prayer back in, we've re-established that Will's faith moved the water, which makes the false prophet in Chapter 4 even more of a villain for trying to steal the credit. Should I keep going and provide the epilogue now that the soul of the story is restored? The catwalk groaned under the vibration of the awakening city. Below, the massive filtration grate carrying Hassan was less than 10 feet away from the primary grinders, titanic brass teeth designed to pulverize desert boulders. "Mina! The gears aren't stopping!" Will's voice was a strained roar. He was hanging by a single line, one hand clamped onto the grate, the other reaching for the terrified 19-year-old. Mina scrambled across the upper platform toward a circular console. It wasn't a computer. It was a series of brass basins, each etched with ancient symbols. At the center stood a heavy, rusted wheel, the valve. She grabbed the spokes and threw her weight into it. It didn't budge. "It's locked," she cried out. She looked down. Will had managed to grab Hassan's belt, but the boy was wedged between 2 brass bars. The rotation was relentless. In seconds, the machine would pull both of them into the grinders. Mina looked back at the valve. She realized then that this wasn't just a mechanical lock. The brass basins around the wheel were dry, encrusted with 1,000 years of salt. The city didn't just need a turn, it needed an offering. She didn't have time to overthink. She reached into her fruit basket and pulled out the single stainless steel canteen they had filled at the first miracle. It was their last drop of life. "Mina! Now!" Will's boots were inches from the grinding teeth. Mina didn't hesitate. She poured the living water into the dry basins. "He that believeth on me, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water." The moment the water hit the salt-crusted brass, the metal began to glow with a soft bioluminescent blue. The salt dissolved instantly. Mina grabbed the wheel again. This time, it didn't feel like iron. It felt like silk. She spun it hard to the right. Deep in the bowels of Ubar, a massive hydraulic sigh echoed through the pipes. The giant filtration grate shuddered and stopped just 3 inches from the grinders. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Will's heavy breathing and the distant manic laughter of Edgar from the depths. "I've got him," Will rasped, hauling Hassan up onto the grate. He looked up at Mina, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and adrenaline. "Tell me you didn't just use the last of our water to do that." "I used what was required, Will," Mina said, her hands still resting on the glowing brass wheel. "And look." As the valve turned, a secondary pipe opened above the console. A stream of water, ice-cold, crystalline, and pressurized, erupted into the basin. The city was no longer just a machine. It was an overflowing fountain. The brass shutter didn't just slam shut, it engaged a secondary hydraulic bypass. As the treasury below reached maximum capacity, the sheer weight of the living water Mina had released created a massive pressure vacuum. "Will, get back!" Mina yelled, pulling him and Hassan away from the center of the catwalk. A muffled boom echoed from the depths, not the sound of destruction, but of a massive subterranean piston firing. Below, the water didn't just drown Edgar, it scoured the chamber. Because the valve of faith was open, the city's ancient filtration system saw the gold and the artifacts in the sump as clogs in the flow. Suddenly, a high-velocity stream of water erupted from a relief pipe near the catwalk. It wasn't just water, it was a torrent of history. Heavy, solid gold coins, stamped with the forgotten seal of Ubar, shot out like literal sparks, clattering across the brass floor. An ornate, emerald-encrusted breastplate skidded across the metal, stopping at Will's boots. A leather satchel, preserved by some ancient resin and heavy with the weight of uncut stones, tumbled out last before the pipe hissed and settled into a steady, clean flow. Will stared at the pile of wealth at their feet. He looked at the emeralds, then back at the smouldering wreck of their 4x4 he could still see in his mind's eye. The truck was worth $80,000, Will muttered, a slow, gritty smile finally breaking through the soot on his face. He picked up the breastplate. It was heavy enough to strain his forearm. This pays for a fleet of trucks, and an office, and the best gear money can buy. Mina knelt, her fingers brushing the cold gold. She didn't look at it with greed, but with the quiet satisfaction of a worker seeing their wages. The Lord doesn't just replace what the locusts have eaten, Will. He provides the seed for the next season. She looked at him, her eyes bright. We aren't just guides anymore, Will. We're stakeholders in something the world can't patent. I think the Vance and Prescott firm just got its start-up capital, Will rasped, reaching out to pull her up. He didn't let go of her hand this time. They emerged from the moor as the sun began its descent, the desert now cool and purple. They were miles from the original crash site, standing atop a ridge that overlooked the vastness of the Rub al-Khali. Hassan was safe, his pockets discreetly heavy with enough gold to care for his village for a generation. As they watched the stars begin to punch through the velvet sky, the professional barrier finally collapsed. Mina, Will said, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. Back there, when I thought I was lost in the heat, you said, "Look at my eyes." Mina turned to him. The prophet was gone and the woman was there, vibrant and raw in the moonlight. I meant it, Will. I wasn't going to let the desert take you. Will took a breath, the stiffness of the Prescott name finally dissolving into the sand. I've spent my life looking for a mission worth dying for. I think I finally found one worth living for. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small, intricately carved gold signet ring he'd scooped up from the catwalk. He didn't offer it as a proposal, not yet, but as a vow. He pressed it into her palm. For the next adventure, he whispered. Mina closed her hand over the gold, then reached up, her touch steady and sure, and pulled him down into a kiss that tasted of salt, survival, and a future that belonged entirely to them. Epilogue. The Ledger and the Light. Zurich, Switzerland, 3 weeks later. The boardroom of Vesper Holdings felt colder than the desert ever had. Edgar sat at the head of a table carved from a single slab of obsidian, his white linen suit replaced by charcoal wool. His skin was peeling, a raw reminder of the sun he had tried to master. Across from him sat 3 men and 2 women, the old money stakeholders who didn't care about miracles. They cared about the $400 million Edgar had burned in the Rub al-Khali. The seismic readings were conclusive, Edgar, the lead investor said, tapping a touch screen. You found a massive subterranean structure, and you returned with... What exactly? The city is real, Edgar rasped, his voice still sounding of sand. The liquefaction event was a security measure. I have the data logs from the drone. We have the logs, a woman interrupted, her voice like ice. We see your security chief, Miller, disappearing into a sump. We see you empty-handed screaming at a brass wall. And we see the 2 guides, the ones you reported as disposable, walking out of the desert with a local boy and a heavy satchel. Edgar's eyes flashed with a manic light. Mina Vance stole the frequency. She tricked the city into opening for her. She has the artifacts. She has the gold. Then she has the capital we expected from you. The lead investor stood up. The contract is terminated, Edgar. Your father's firm has been leveraged to cover the loss. You're a liability. As they walked out, Edgar stared at the empty screen. He didn't see failure, he saw a target. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out. The tactical folding knife from the Himalayas. The blade was chipped from the basalt floor of Shambhala, and the handle was still stained with the red dust of the Rub al-Khali. He flicked it open. The click was the only sound in the room. He didn't have the heart of the mountain, and he didn't have the gold of Ubar. But he had the knife, and he had a new coordinate. It's not over, he whispered to the empty room. She's going to the Amazon next. I know her research. If she thinks she can hide in the canopy with my birthright, she's wrong. Vance and Prescott Acquisitions, Virginia, USA. The office was still half empty, smelling of fresh paint and expensive cedar. The air conditioner hummed quietly in the background, a luxury they'd never take for granted again. It was a modest space on the outside, but the security system was top tier, paid for by the sale of a single emerald-encrusted breastplate. Mina walked toward the large mahogany desk at the center of the room. She was wearing a professional blazer, but her hair was still loose, and her eyes still held the fire of the desert. She set her woven fruit basket down on the desk with a soft thud. It was empty of sand now, but it still held her Bible and the new high-density satellite maps they had just commissioned. Will Prescott walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked different. The stiffness of the soldier had softened into the steady confidence of a partner. He set a cup down on her desk and leaned over, looking at the map spread out before her. The funds cleared this morning, Will said, his voice warm. We've got the bush plane, the permits for the Peruvian border, and a crew that doesn't ask questions about miracles. Mina looked up at him, her hand instinctively finding the gold signet ring hanging on a chain around her neck. Edgar won't stop, Will. He's lost everything, which makes him more dangerous than when he had the SUVs. Will leaned down, his face inches from hers, the memory of their desert kiss hanging in the air. Let him come. He's chasing gold, Mina. We're chasing the truth. He'll never be fast enough. Mina smiled, tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and tapped a coordinate in the heart of the Amazon. Then let's get to work, partner. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking and subscribing. The silent